The morning sun reflected off the pristine canopy of the Lightning II, casting fractured rainbows across the tarmac at RAF Lakenheath. Technical Sergeant Kira, Phantom, Nakamura moved with practiced precision, her chamois cloth tracing methodical circles across the advanced polymer surface. To the passing airmen, she was just another maintenance crew member performing routine cleaning duties. What they didn't know was that she was memorizing every rivet, every sensor array, every minute detail of the aircraft that would soon become her instrument of legend. The sound of approaching footsteps on concrete barely registered above the distant whine of jet engines warming up for morning sorties. Kira continued her work, muscle memory guiding her movements while her mind wandered to the classified briefing she'd attended 12 hours earlier. Intelligence reports suggested something unprecedented was developing in the contested airspace over Eastern Europe. Patterns that didn't fit conventional warfare. Aircraft appearing on radar that shouldn't exist. Pilots reporting visual contacts that vanished before weapon systems could achieve lock. Sergeant Nakamura. The voice carried the crisp authority of command. She turned to find Wing Commander Harrison Fletcher standing at attention, his weathered face grave beneath salt and pepper brows. What happened next would be discussed in hushed tones throughout the base for months afterward. The Wing Commander, a man who'd commanded respect from fighter pilots across 3 continents, raised his hand in a perfect military salute. The chamois cloth slipped from Kira's fingers, landing silently on the tarmac. Around them, the normal bustle of base operations seemed to pause. Maintenance crews stopped their work. Ground control personnel turned from their equipment. Even the screaming turbines seemed to quiet to a whisper. Fletcher held the salute with unwavering precision, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that spoke of classified knowledge and desperate necessity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, "your country needs you to remember who you used to be." The words hung in the air like vapor trails at high altitude. Kira felt something shift inside her chest, a feeling she'd buried 3 years ago when bureaucratic politics and institutional prejudice had forced her from the cockpit to the maintenance bay. The feeling of altitude beneath her wings, the sensation of controlling forces that could reshape the very air around her, the profound responsibility of carrying a nation's hopes at 30,000 feet and Mach 2. Fletcher lowered his salute but maintained his stance. "Report to briefing room Alpha 7 in 15 minutes. Full flight gear." He paused, studying her face with the calculating gaze of a commander weighing impossible odds. "And Phantom." The use of her call sign sent electricity down her spine. "Bring your helmet." As Fletcher turned and walked away, Kira stared at her reflection in the F-35's canopy. The face looking back carried scars, some visible, others etched in the careful way she held her shoulders, the measured precision of her movements. But beneath the surface, something ancient and powerful was awakening, something that had never truly died, only waited. The maintenance uniform felt suddenly foreign against her skin. 3 years of exile were about to end. The sky was calling her home, and this time, she wouldn't let anyone ground her again. Not when everything depended on what she could do at the edge of space, where angels feared to tread and only phantoms dared to fly. In the distance, another F-35 lifted off the runway, its afterburners painting twin columns of fire against the morning sky. Soon, very soon, she would join that celestial dance once more. Fletcher's words echoed in her mind as she bent to retrieve the fallen chamois. "Remember who you used to be." The problem was, she'd never forgotten. She'd simply been forced to pretend. Briefing room Alpha 7 waited. Her helmet waited. The sky waited. And somewhere in the contested darkness above Eastern Europe, an enemy unlike any they'd ever faced was about to discover why they called her Phantom. Kira Nakamura straightened her shoulders, left the cloth where it lay, and walked toward her destiny with the measured pace of someone who'd always known this moment would come. The F-35 behind her gleamed in the sunlight, no longer needing cleaning. It was ready. So was she. The maintenance bay doors stood open like cathedral arches, framing her silhouette against the vast expanse of English sky. Inside that briefing room, classified files would reveal the truth behind the mysterious contacts, electronic warfare signatures that defied known technology, flight patterns that suggested capabilities beyond current aerospace engineering, and at the center of it all, a single conclusion that would change everything. They weren't alone up there. The 15-minute countdown had begun. Kira's exile was over. The real war was about to start, and they'd need every phantom they could find. The heavy security door of briefing room Alpha 7 sealed behind Kira, with the finality of a tomb closing. The room's occupants turned as one, 12 of the RAF's finest pilots, their faces bearing the weathered confidence of men and women who'd pushed the envelope of human flight. Their expressions shifted from curious to skeptical to barely concealed hostility as they recognized the maintenance sergeant entering their sacred space. "You've got to be kidding," muttered squadron leader Marcus Reaper Thornfield, his Oxford accent dripping with disdain. "They're bringing mechanics to pilot briefings now." Flight Lieutenant Diana Phoenix Webb's laugh carried no warmth. "Next, they'll be asking the janitors for tactical advice." The other pilots chuckled, their amusement echoing off the windowless walls like rounds fired in an enclosed space. Kira moved to the back of the room without a word, her flight suit, hastily retrieved from a locker that had remained untouched for 3 years, feeling both familiar and foreign against her skin. The helmet under her arm carried dents and scratches from countless sorties, each mark a memory of battles fought in foreign skies. She'd considered leaving it behind, but Fletcher's words had been specific. "Bring your helmet." There was always a reason for specificity in military orders. Wing Commander Fletcher entered through a side door, his arms loaded with classified files marked with red diagonal stripes. Behind him came a figure that made the room's temperature drop 10 degrees, Air Vice Marshal Catherine Iron Lady Blackwood, her uniform bearing ribbons that read like a catalogue of Britain's modern military history. The pilots straightened instinctively, their mockery dying in their throats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fletcher announced, activating the room's electronic countermeasures with a switch that bathed them all in white noise. "What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels. What you see in this room stays in this room. What you learn in this room may very well determine the outcome of a conflict that officially doesn't exist." The main display screen flickered to life, showing radar tracking data from the past 72 hours. Green blips moved in patterns that seemed to mock the laws of physics, 90-degree turns at speeds that should have liquefied any human pilot, sustained flight at altitudes where even the most advanced aircraft should stall, electronic signatures that appeared and vanished like ghosts dancing on the edge of perception. These contacts first appeared over restricted airspace in Romania. Blackwood's voice carried the authority of someone who'd briefed prime ministers in underground bunkers. "Initial assessment suggested experimental Russian technology. We were wrong." A new slide replaced the radar data, gun camera footage from an F-22 Raptor, the timestamp showing 3 days prior. The assembled pilots leaned forward as the video played. Through the Raptor's targeting system, they watched an object that defied classification. Its shape seemed to shift and flow like mercury, reflecting the surrounding sky so perfectly that it appeared more like a distortion in reality than a physical craft. The F-22's weapons systems cycled through target acquisition protocols, the computer unable to achieve a stable lock on something that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Jesus Christ," whispered Flight Lieutenant Ghost Morrison, his Australian accent thick with disbelief. "What the hell is that thing?" The video continued. The mysterious craft executed a maneuver that should have been impossible, a flat spin that transitioned into a vertical climb without any visible thrust signature. The F-22's pilot tried to follow, his aircraft screaming in protest as G-forces pushed the airframe beyond design limits. Then, without warning, the unknown craft simply vanished. No engine signature, no radar fade, no electronic interference. One moment it existed, the next it was gone as if it had never been there at all. Stealth technology beyond our current understanding, Fletcher continued, his voice steady despite the implications. Electronic warfare capabilities that make our most advanced systems look like children's toys, and flight characteristics that suggest either revolutionary propulsion technology or, he paused, meeting each pilot's eyes in turn, something else entirely. Squadron Leader Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sir, are we suggesting these are? We're not suggesting anything, Squadron Leader, Blackwood interrupted, her tone cutting through speculation like a blade. We're dealing with facts. Fact 1. These craft have been observed over increasingly sensitive military installations across Eastern Europe. Fact 2. Conventional interception attempts have resulted in complete failure. Fact 3. Yesterday morning, one of these objects was detected approaching British airspace. The room fell silent except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant rumble of aircraft operations. Outside these walls, the normal business of military aviation continued: training flights, maintenance schedules, administrative duties. Inside, 12 pilots and one maintenance sergeant were being briefed on humanity's first contact with something beyond their understanding. Kira remained motionless in the back of the room, her expression unreadable. She'd seen classified footage before, witnessed test flights of experimental aircraft that wouldn't be acknowledged for decades. But this was different. This was the moment when everything changed, when the comfortable certainties of atmospheric warfare gave way to possibilities that expanded beyond the edge of space. The implications were staggering, but her mind was already working the problem with the methodical precision that had made her legendary in previous conflicts. Unknown capabilities required adaptive tactics. Unprecedented threats demanded unprecedented responses. And somewhere in the data patterns flickering across the screen, she could see the ghost of a solution forming. Fletcher clicked to the next slide, and Kira's world shifted on its axis once more. The screen showed a photograph of herself, 3 years younger, standing beside an F-35 on a tarmac in Syria, her helmet under one arm and a confident smile on her face. The image caption read, Technical Sergeant Kira Nakamura, call sign, Phantom, 47 combat sorties, 0 losses. Which brings us, Fletcher continued, his gaze finding hers across the room, to why Sergeant Nakamura is here. The pilots turned as one, their expressions shifting from confusion to recognition to something approaching awe. Phoenix Webb's face had gone pale beneath her tan. Reaper Thornfield's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Even Ghost Morrison, who'd flown combat missions over Afghanistan, looked stunned. Because they all knew the stories. They'd all heard the whispered legends that circulated through pilot briefing rooms like ghost stories told around midnight fires. Tales of an American pilot who'd volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who'd flown solo deep strike operations that should have been suicide runs. A pilot who'd earned her call sign not through bravado or luck, but through an almost supernatural ability to appear where enemies least expected and vanish before they could respond. They'd assumed the stories were exaggerated, embellished through repeated telling until fiction overwhelmed fact. Looking at the maintenance sergeant standing quietly in the back of the room, they were beginning to realize they'd been wrong about everything. The next slide contained mission reports, after-action reviews, and commendation letters written by commanding officers who'd watched her work. The citations read like fiction. Sergeant Nakamura successfully engaged and destroyed 4 enemy aircraft while operating alone behind enemy lines. Despite being outnumbered 8-1, Sergeant Nakamura's tactical brilliance resulted in complete mission success with no friendly casualties. Her ability to remain undetected while operating in heavily defended airspace borders on the supernatural. Fletcher allowed the silence to stretch until it became uncomfortable. 3 years ago, Sergeant Nakamura was reassigned to maintenance duties following a disagreement with Pentagon leadership, regarding the implementation of autonomous weapons systems in combat aircraft. Her opposition to removing human judgment from lethal force decisions was deemed incompatible with future Air Force doctrine. Air Vice Marshal Blackwood stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. Recent events have demonstrated that Sergeant Nakamura's concerns about autonomous systems may have been prophetic. These unknown aircraft display capabilities that suggest artificial intelligence far beyond our current understanding. If we're going to counter this threat, we need pilots who understand both the tactical and ethical implications of fighting an enemy that may not be entirely human. The room's atmosphere had shifted completely. The mockery and skepticism had evaporated, replaced by the tense focus of professional warriors facing an unprecedented challenge. These pilots had spent their careers preparing for conventional warfare, air-to-air combat against known adversaries using familiar technology. The prospect of engaging something that defied the basic assumptions of atmospheric flight was forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Kira finally spoke, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions at supersonic speeds. "What's the mission profile?" Fletcher smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. "Reconnaissance and potential interdiction of unknown aircraft operating in British airspace. Rules of engagement to be determined based on contact assessment. Mission timeline." He paused, checking his watch. "Immediate departure. Your aircraft is already being prepped for flight." The simple statement carried enormous implications. They weren't talking about a future deployment or extended training program. Whatever was happening in the skies above Europe had escalated to the point where immediate action was required. The bureaucratic processes that normally governed military aviation had been bypassed entirely. Politics, regulations, and institutional prejudice had been swept aside by the urgent necessity of dealing with a threat that couldn't wait for proper channels. Squadron leader Thornfield cleared his throat, his earlier arrogance replaced by professional curiosity. "Sergeant, what should we call you?" Kira considered the question carefully. For 3 years, she'd been Technical Sergeant Nakamura, a skilled maintenance worker with an unusual background. But standing in this briefing room, surrounded by pilots preparing for missions that might determine humanity's future, that identity felt like a costume she was finally able to discard. "Phantom," she said simply. "My call sign is Phantom." The word hung in the air like a challenge issued to the unknown forces gathering beyond the horizon. Outside, her F-35 waited on the tarmac, its systems running through pre-flight checks performed by ground crews who understood the urgency, even if they didn't know the specifics. Advanced avionics packages had been installed during the night, electronic warfare suites normally reserved for special operations, sensor arrays that pushed the boundaries of current technology, weapons systems configured for threats that officially didn't exist. Fletcher closed the classified files and activated the room's secure communication system. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are now part of Operation Celestial Guardian. Your mission is to maintain air superiority over British airspace against an adversary of unknown capabilities and intentions. You will operate under modified rules of engagement that prioritize intelligence gathering while maintaining defensive readiness." He turned to address Kira directly. "Phantom, your specific tasking is solo reconnaissance of suspected contact zones. Your aircraft has been modified with enhanced stealth characteristics and extended range capabilities. You will proceed to patrol coordinates that will be uploaded to your navigation system during pre-flight checks." The mission parameters were clear, but the subtext was even clearer. They were sending her alone into contested airspace to make contact with something that had already proven capable of outmaneuvering the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. It was exactly the kind of assignment that had made her legendary, and exactly the kind that could easily become a one-way trip. Kira nodded, accepting the mission with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her entire career. Fear was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. Doubt was a weakness that could get people killed. All that mattered was the mission, the aircraft, and the vast expanse of sky that had always been her true home. "Understood, sir. When do I launch?" Blackwood checked her watch, her expression grim. "Wheels up in 20 minutes. Phantom." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Bring them home, all of them." The dismissal was implicit but clear. The pilots filed out of the briefing room, their conversations subdued and focused on mission preparation. Equipment checks, flight plan reviews, last-minute coordination with ground control, the familiar rituals that transformed ordinary human beings into precision instruments of aerial warfare. Kira remained behind as the room emptied, staring at the frozen image on the display screen. The mysterious craft hung in digital suspension, its impossible geometries mocking everything she understood about flight dynamics and material science. Somewhere above the clouds, others like it were waiting, watching, perhaps planning. Fletcher approached her as she studied the image, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. "Second thoughts?" "No, sir," she replied without hesitation. "Just trying to understand what I'm flying into." "None of us understand it," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions made with incomplete information. "That's why we need you up there. Your tactical instincts, your ability to adapt to unprecedented situations. Those skills may be the only things that can level the playing field." Kira turned from the screen to face him directly. "Sir, what aren't you telling me?" Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing security protocols against operational necessity. Finally, he spoke in the carefully measured tones of someone revealing classified information. "Yesterday's incursion over British airspace wasn't random. The object was detected approaching RAF Fylingdales, our ballistic missile early warning station. It conducted what can only be described as a detailed reconnaissance scan of our most sensitive defensive installations." The implications hit her like a physical blow. If these unknown craft were conducting systematic intelligence gathering on strategic military targets, this was no longer a matter of scientific curiosity or first contact protocols. This was preparation for something much more serious. "They're mapping our defenses," she said, the tactical picture becoming clear. "That's our assessment," Fletcher confirmed. "Which means whatever comes next, they'll know exactly where we're strongest and where we're vulnerable. Your mission isn't just reconnaissance, Phantom. You may be our only chance to gather intelligence on their capabilities before they decide to test our defenses directly." The burden of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar weight. She'd carried it before, in the skis over Syria, above the mountains of Afghanistan, through contested airspace where the wrong decision could cost hundreds of lives. But this was different. This time, the stakes might extend far beyond military objectives to the future of human civilization itself. "I'll find them," she promised, the words carrying the quiet certainty of someone who'd never failed a mission when it truly mattered. Fletcher nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Phantom, if you encounter something beyond your capability to handle, disengage immediately. We need you to come back with information, not become another mystery for intelligence analysts to puzzle over." She understood the unspoken message. Other pilots had already made contact with these craft. Other pilots hadn't returned with answers, or in some cases, hadn't returned at all. The morning's briefing had focused on radar contacts and gun camera footage, but beneath the clinical analysis lay a more disturbing truth. Humanity was no longer alone in its mastery of the skis. "Yes, sir," she acknowledged, then turned and walked toward the door with the measured pace of someone approaching destiny. The corridors of the operations building buzzed with controlled urgency. Personnel moved with the focused efficiency of professionals preparing for something unprecedented. Radio chatter crackled from communication centers as air traffic controllers coordinated with military installations across Europe. External radar stations reported normal commercial traffic, but the classified networks told a different story. Anomalous contacts appearing and vanishing across a dozen countries, always just beyond the range of conventional interception. Kiera's footsteps echoed against polished floors as she made her way toward the flight line. Through reinforced windows, she could see her F-35 being prepared for launch, ground crews swarming around the aircraft like pit crews servicing a race car. External fuel tanks had been mounted for extended range. Electronic warfare pods bristled with sensors designed to detect and analyze unknown emissions. Even the aircraft's paint scheme had been modified, a matte gray finish that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This was no longer the maintenance aircraft she'd been cleaning that morning. This was a weapon system configured for a war that officially didn't exist, prepared to engage an enemy that challenged every assumption about aerial combat. The transformation was symbolic, both of the aircraft and of herself. The maintenance sergeant was being left behind. Phantom was going back to work. The pre-flight ritual had always been sacred to Kiera, a meditation in motion that connected her consciousness with the machine that would carry her life into the unforgiving arena of three-dimensional combat. Her hands moved across switches and displays with the muscle memory of thousands of hours, checking systems that had been upgraded far beyond standard specifications. The electronic warfare suite hummed with barely contained power. Advanced radar arrays rotated through frequency sweeps designed to detect stealth signatures. Even the aircraft's artificial intelligence had been enhanced with classified software packages that treated every sensor input as potential threat data. "Phantom, this is Tower Control," the voice crackled through her headset with the crisp professionalism of British air traffic management. "You are cleared for immediate departure on runway 27, Vector 340, climb and maintain flight level 400. Contact Meridian Control on guard frequency when airborne." She acknowledged the clearance and advanced the throttles, feeling the familiar surge of power as the F-35's engine spooled up to military thrust. The Lightning II rolled forward with deceptive grace, its advanced fly-by-wire systems translating her inputs into precise control surface movements. Around the airfield, ground personnel had stopped their normal activities to watch her departure. Word had spread through the base's informal communication networks. Something significant was happening, and Phantom Nakamura was at the center of it. The runway stretched ahead like a concrete river leading to infinity. At 150 knots, Kiera pulled back on the stick and felt the earth fall away beneath her landing gear. The sensation never got old, that moment when gravity released its hold, and the aircraft transformed from a ground-bound machine into something that belonged to the sky. The F-35 climbed through scattered clouds, its engine painting a contrail signature that would be visible to anyone watching from below. "Meridian Control, Phantom is airborne and climbing," she reported, switching to the secure frequency that would connect her with military controllers tracking the mission from underground bunkers. "Request Vector to patrol coordinates." "Phantom, Meridian Control, we have you on scope. Proceed direct to waypoint Alpha and maintain current altitude. Be advised, radar is showing intermittent contacts bearing 090, range approximately 200 nautical miles. Contact classification unknown." The tactical display in her cockpit updated automatically, showing the patrol area as a red box overlaid on the digital map of British airspace. It was positioned over the North Sea, far enough from commercial air routes to avoid civilian interference, but close enough to major population centers to serve as an early warning line. If the unknown craft were planning another incursion into British territory, this was where they would likely make their approach. At 40,000 feet, the sky took on the deep blue-black of space, with only the thinnest atmosphere separating her from the infinite void. Below, England spread out like a detailed model, its cities and highways reduced to geometric patterns by distance and altitude. The view had always humbled her, a reminder that human civilization, for all its complexity and achievement, occupied only the thinnest layer of habitability on a planet that spun through an universe of incomprehensible scale. Phantom, Meridian Control. Be advised, we're detecting electronic emissions consistent with advanced stealth technology bearing 085, range approximately 150 nautical miles. Emissions are intermittent and do not correlate with known aircraft signatures. Kira's pulse quickened as she adjusted her heading toward the contact. This was it, the moment when theoretical became tactical, when briefing room speculation transformed into lethal reality. Her hands moved across the weapon's control panel, activating systems that could deliver devastating firepower at beyond visual range. But the rules of engagement were clear. Observe, analyze, report. Only engage if directly threatened. The F-35's advanced radar began painting targets that defied conventional identification. The signatures appeared and vanished like ghosts, sometimes showing solid returns that suggested metallic construction, other times displaying characteristics more consistent with atmospheric phenomena. The aircraft's artificial intelligence cycled through identification protocols, trying to match the sensor data against its database of known aircraft types. Every analysis came back with the same result: unknown. Contact bearing 087, range 90 nautical miles, she reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Signature characteristics do not match any known aircraft type, attempting visual identification. At this range, visual contact would normally be impossible even in clear weather. But the F-35's advanced optics package included telescopic cameras capable of resolving details at distances that stretched the boundaries of atmospheric clarity. As she adjusted the sensor array's focus, shapes began to emerge from the digital noise, forms that challenged everything she understood about aerodynamic design. The craft ahead of her seemed to exist in a state of controlled fluidity, its surfaces shifting and adapting like living tissue. Traditional aircraft design emphasized fixed geometries optimized for specific flight regimes, but this vehicle appeared to reconfigure itself continuously, presenting different profiles to airflow patterns that changed with altitude, speed, and maneuvering requirements. It was less like watching a machine and more like observing some exotic life form that had evolved in the rarefied atmosphere of the upper troposphere. Meridian Control, Phantom has visual contact with unknown aircraft, she transmitted, her training overriding the instinctive awe that threatened to overwhelm her tactical focus. Object appears to be approximately 60 feet in length, displaying unconventional aerodynamic characteristics. No visible propulsion signature, but maintaining steady flight at my altitude. The response came immediately, voice stressed with the urgency of real-time intelligence gathering. Phantom, this is Meridian Actual. Can you determine if the craft is aware of your presence? It was a question that cut to the heart of the tactical situation. If the unknown aircraft hadn't detected her approach, she might be able to gather detailed intelligence without triggering a potentially dangerous first contact scenario. But if it was already aware of her presence and choosing not to react, that suggested confidence in its capabilities that bordered on contempt for conventional air power. As if in response to her thoughts, the craft ahead began to change. What had appeared to be a smooth, streamlined form started displaying surface textures that seemed to ripple and flow like water. Sections that had been metallic became translucent, revealing internal structures that pulsed with patterns of light that followed no design philosophy she recognized. The vehicle's flight path, which had been straight and level, began to incorporate gentle undulations that served no apparent aerodynamic purpose. Meridian Control, the craft is definitely aware of my presence, she reported, watching as the unknown aircraft began what could only be described as a display behavior. It's performing some kind of demonstration, changing configuration, altering flight patterns, almost like it's trying to communicate. The tactical implications were staggering. If these craft were piloted by intelligence capable of recognizing and responding to human contact attempts, then this was no longer a matter of countering unknown technology. This was first contact with a civilization that had mastered physics in ways that made humanity's greatest achievements look primitive by comparison. Phantom, maintain current distance and continue observation, came the instruction from Meridian Control. Do not attempt to close with the unknown aircraft. Intelligence indicates these vehicles have demonstrated defensive capabilities when approached too closely. Kira acknowledged the instruction while adjusting her flight path to maintain a parallel course with the mysterious craft. At this distance, her sensors could gather detailed data on the vehicle's emissions signatures, structural characteristics, and flight patterns without triggering whatever defensive systems it might possess. The information flowing into her aircraft's computers would be analyzed by teams of specialists who would try to reverse engineer capabilities that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics. But as she watched the craft's continued display behavior, Kira began to suspect that simple observation might not be enough. The vehicle's movements had taken on an almost musical quality, with configuration changes that followed rhythmic patterns too complex to be random. If this was indeed some form of communication attempt, responding appropriately might require more than passive sensor gathering. The decision tree was clear but dangerous. Follow orders and maintain distance, potentially missing an opportunity for meaningful contact. Or take initiative and attempt reciprocal communication, risking escalation into conflict with an adversary whose capabilities remained largely unknown. As a maintenance sergeant, the choice would have been simple: follow regulations and avoid unnecessary risk. But Phantom Nakamura had never been just a maintenance sergeant. She was a combat pilot with an intuitive understanding of aerial behavior patterns, someone who could read intention and capability in the subtle movements of aircraft operating at the edge of human performance. The unknown craft was trying to tell her something, and 3 years of exile had taught her that sometimes the greatest risk was failing to act when action was required. The decision crystallized in her mind with the clarity that had always characterized her best tactical choices. Following orders was important, but interpreting the intent behind those orders was what separated competent pilots from legendary ones. Meridian Control wanted intelligence on these craft. The most valuable intelligence often came from interaction rather than passive observation. Meridian Control, Phantom requesting permission to attempt non-aggressive contact with unknown aircraft, she transmitted, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd made similar requests in combat zones where hesitation cost lives. I believe the craft is attempting to establish communication. Recommend cautious response to avoid missing potential intelligence opportunity. The radio silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in tactical time, before Meridian Actual's voice returned with the weight of command decisions made in real time. Phantom, you are authorized to attempt limited contact procedures. Maintain defensive readiness and disengage immediately if the situation deteriorates. All sensor data is being recorded for post-mission analysis. Kira acknowledged the authorization and began a careful approach sequence, reducing her closing rate to barely perceptible movement. The F-35's advanced fly-by-wire systems translated her subtle control inputs into precisely calibrated thrust adjustments, allowing her to maneuver with the delicacy of a surgeon despite operating at speeds where split-second decisions could mean the difference between successful contact and catastrophic collision. The unknown craft's response was immediate and unmistakable. Its surface configurations shifted to mirror her aircraft's flight attitude, creating visual patterns that seemed designed to demonstrate awareness and intent. When she executed a gentle banking turn to the right, the craft responded with its own turn, maintaining precise formation spacing that suggested either sophisticated automation or piloting skills that exceeded human norms. "Contact is responding to flight pattern changes," she reported, her voice steady despite the historic significance of what was unfolding. "Demonstrating formation flying capabilities and apparent communication intent. Recommend escalating to basic aerial signals." The protocols for first contact with unknown aircraft had been developed during the Cold War, refined through decades of intercepting foreign military flights that probed national airspace boundaries. But those procedures assumed contact with conventional aircraft piloted by human beings operating under military command structures. Nothing in the standard playbook addressed communication with technology that appeared to transcend the basic limitations of atmospheric flight. Kira began with the most universal of aerial signals, a gentle rocking of her aircraft's wings, the traditional aviator's greeting that had been used since the earliest days of powered flight. The response was so immediate and precise that it suggested either instantaneous decision-making or automated systems programmed to recognize human communication attempts. The unknown craft executed a perfect wing rock sequence, its fluid surfaces shifting to emphasize the movement in ways that no conventional aircraft could achieve. But the response went beyond simple mimicry. The craft's wing rock incorporated harmonics and variations that suggested not just acknowledgement but elaboration, as if it were responding to her greeting with a more sophisticated version of the same message. "Meridian Control, we have established basic communication with the unknown aircraft," she transmitted, her training fighting against the awe that threatened to overwhelm her professional focus. "Craft is demonstrating advanced understanding of human aerial signals and appears to be attempting more complex communication." The tactical situation had evolved beyond anything covered in her extensive combat training. She was no longer conducting reconnaissance on a potential threat. She was participating in humanity's first confirmed communication with a technology that represented either revolutionary human engineering or contact with intelligence from beyond Earth. Either possibility carried implications that extended far beyond military considerations. The unknown craft began a new sequence of movements that seemed designed to test her ability to follow complex aerial choreography. Banking turns that transitioned smoothly into vertical climbs, barrel rolls that incorporated changes in configuration, flight patterns that traced geometric shapes in three-dimensional space with mathematical precision. Each maneuver was executed with a grace that made her F-35's capabilities seem crude by comparison. Kira responded as best she could, her aircraft's conventional control surfaces limiting her ability to match the fluid movements of the unknown craft. But her piloting skills, honed through years of combat operations, allowed her to approximate the demonstrated patterns well enough to maintain the communication dialogue. The effort required constant attention to her aircraft's flight envelope, pushing the F-35 to its performance limits, while maintaining the precise control necessary for complex formation flying. "Unknown craft is demonstrating flight capabilities significantly beyond current aerospace technology," she reported, her breath coming in measured gasps as G-forces from aggressive maneuvering pressed her into her ejection seat. "Able to execute flight patterns that would be impossible for conventional aircraft. Communication appears to be progressing to more sophisticated levels." The response from Meridian Control carried undertones of barely controlled excitement. Teams of analysts were undoubtedly dissecting every second of sensor data, trying to understand propulsion systems that left no exhaust signatures, materials that seemed to shift their physical properties in real time, and control systems that responded to pilot inputs with inhuman precision. But for Kira, flying formation with something that defied every law of physics she understood, the technical analysis was secondary to the profound emotional impact of the encounter. She was participating in a moment that would be remembered long after the political and military implications had been resolved. First contact between human civilization and something that represented either the culmination of terrestrial engineering or the first confirmation that intelligence existed beyond Earth. The unknown craft had begun transmitting electromagnetic signals that her aircraft's sensors could detect but not decode, patterns of emissions that contained too much structure to be random, but followed no encryption protocols in her computer's databases. The F-35's artificial intelligence systems worked frantically to identify patterns, correlate sequences, and extract meaning from data streams that might represent language, technical specifications, or something entirely beyond human comprehension. Receiving structured electromagnetic transmissions from unknown craft, she reported, watching as her cockpit displays filled with cascading data that represented the first attempt at technological communication between species. Signals contain complex patterns that may represent linguistic or technical information. Recommend immediate analysis by cryptographic specialists. The implications were staggering. If the transmissions contained decipherable information, humanity might be on the verge of acquiring technological knowledge that could revolutionize every aspect of civilization. Energy systems that operated without apparent fuel sources, materials that could alter their physical properties on command, propulsion technologies that ignored conventional limitations of thrust and reaction.